So we've had a look at the horizon. Let's turn our attention to the more immediate risks and challenges we face, from the big picture to perhaps the regulatory picture. Do our current maritime regulations adequately control the financial and the insurance risks of operation? Prescriptive regulation was in place when the Deepwater Horizon rig met its demise in the Gulf of Mexico. If it had been operating in the North Sea, it would have been subject to risk-based regulation. So as insurers, you may want to ask yourself, what's the difference? Risk-based regulation in the North Sea puts the responsibility on the operator to identify the risks, to mitigate them, and to get an independent party to ensure that the solution is appropriate, and then present the safety case to the authorities. As our assets get bigger, as we enter hostile environments to search for new stores of energy, as we use more advanced materials and systems, the technology challenge continues to increase. The pace of development increases in line with the speed of implementation. In our modern world, we simply do not have the luxury of time-based testing and the incremental change regimes upon which prescriptive regulation depends. Goal-based regulation doesn't specify how to achieve compliance. It sets goals that allow alternative ways to comply. For example, people shall be prevented from falling over the edge of a cliff. It's an example of goal-based regulation. In prescriptive regulation, the guidance would read, you shall install a 1-metre high rail at the top of the cliff. There are acknowledged shortcomings of prescriptive regulation. The parties applying such regulations are only required to carry out the mandated actions to discharge their legal responsibilities. If these actions do not prevent an accident, it is the regulations and the regulators who are seen to be deficient, not the parties applying them, who, by the way, the law holds clearly responsible. There has always been a contradiction, if not inherent conflict, in prescriptive regulation. Prescriptive regulation tends to be a distillation of past experience, and as such, while having a value as a corporate or state memory, it becomes less and less relevant over time. At worst, it creates unnecessary dangers in industries that are technically innovative. It is the innovators that are best placed to ensure the safety of their designs, not the regulator. Clearly, prescriptive regulations cannot cope with a wide diversity of design solutions. Also, prescriptive regulation encodes the best engineering practices at the time they were written and rapidly becomes deficient when those practices change. For example, with evolving technology, in fact, it is likely that prescriptive regulation eventually prevents industry from adopting the best practices. There are clear benefits from adopting a goal-based approach, which gives greater freedom to develop technical solutions and accommodate different standards. But the trend towards risk-based approach does, however, raise questions about how insurers will assess risk if the methods by which goals are achieved vary according to the designer and to the operator. I will leave that question unanswered for those in the room far more qualified than I to consider. But it is fair to say that the people who most understand the risks of a specific asset are not those who designed it and those who will operate it. Assessing asset risk involves a number of factors, including design, the operating environment, the duty factor, the operator's experience and ability, the appetite for risk embedded in the operator's management system, and the maintenance system. This is why I'm concerned about the tendency of insurers and financiers to tightly focus on asset value and type when they assess whether to accept any risk. I will return to this later when I look at the role of the human element. So if risk-based regulation is seen as superior in countries such as the UK and Norway, why aren't the US authorities wholeheartedly accepting it? Perhaps the biggest hurdle is found in the courtroom. In a litigious society where any incident is likely to end up in court, operational actions have to be rigorously defended. Prescriptive regulation says you must do A, you must do B, and you must do C before you can operate. Once you prove you've done A, B, and C, regardless if it is known to be appropriate, you're free to operate. And you can hide behind adherence to the regulation in your defence should something go wrong. Risk-based regulation is more subjective. Engineers and operators assess the components of risk, the people, the plant, and the process, agree on the severity of the individual risks, and put design or operating process in place to minimise it. This flexibility is much more difficult to defend in court, especially after an event where an unexpected sequences of events has caused a failure and everyone has the benefit of hindsight. Transitioning from a prescriptive to a risk-based regulatory regime requires a different approach from designers and regulators. To some degree, it requires retraining. You're asking people to take a wider view of the risks to ensure that the people, the plant, and the process issues have been properly considered. It's a different skill set than simply having to check compliance with a prescription. The transition takes time, and during any transition, there's risk. So as insurers, when those ships and other assets you cover move from a prescriptive to risk-based regulatory regime, you may ask yourself if those entrusted with risk mitigation in the new system fully understand the complete challenge. I strongly believe that goal-based regulations provide the best risk mitigation in a technical environment that is evolving quickly. It is a shame when the priorities of legal environment override our mandate to make assets safer and make them more sustainable. So we've covered the risks of getting a ship's strategy wrong. We've covered the risks of the wrong regulatory regime. So what else? Simple. We must now address risks posed by the workforce, the human element. Because as I said earlier, if the social side of progress is ignored, we greatly limit our potential. It is widely accepted that the cause of most accidents is human error, and yet the focus of most regulation is squarely on the asset. If you look back at the original Lloyd's Register of Ships from 1760, there are two columns that no longer appear. One is the detail of the fitted guns and cannons, and the other is the name of the captain. The captain was recorded when ships were assessed for risk in the days of Edward Lloyd's original coffee shop, because the right captain with the right experience went a long way to mitigating the risks of a voyage. How have we lost sight of that? Today, all insurers are aware that the biggest obstacle to a lasting improvement in casualty rates is human error. Statistics collated by the International Union of Marine Insurance show that human failure is a leading cause of lost lives, vessels, and the valuable cargoes that they carry. Moreover, IUMI's Deirdre Littlefield said last year that it was fully committed to improving maritime safety by improving the understanding of the role people play in safe operations. Despite this, most regulation continues to focus on assets and their control systems. Another accident, add another micro switch or another control system, adding to the complexity of the operation and probably increasing the risks. Understanding the human element in shipping operations and its impact on risk is critical. We all know the proper training and experience are the keys to producing reliable mariners. But this applies to the underwriters, loss control professionals, and surveyors who assume and manage the risks associated with international trade. Clearly, the ability to assess if a ship is well operated requires a different skill set to assess if it is well designed and well maintained. The qualifications of surveyors and regulators are often discussed. But if the influence of the human element on safe operations is going to be fully understood, it will require our entire industry to acquire a new skill set. crew selection and training, maintenance in terminals, on board ships, as well as basic operations such as loading and discharge, can be positively or negatively affected by economic conditions. All marine professionals must be aware of how this potentially impacts on the risk of their business. Today's modern ship is a highly complex piece of machinery, largely controlled by computer programs and systems, from the bridge to the engine room. Making time for thorough training in these new technologies is vital for all parties, onshore and off. Language is another big issue when crews from different countries come together with little or no common language skills. Marine insurers and the P&I clubs are largely agreed that, in an ideal world, shipping should take its lead from the aviation industry, where English is the undisputed common language. But in practice, the lack of common language remains a risk. I am convinced that we are not paying enough attention to the human element. Standardising the training and qualifications of seafarers and seafarer training establishments, ensuring a higher level of competency for operating procedures, maintenance, and the management of shipboard staff will go a long way to minimising these risks. As I said at the beginning, properly assessing risk can be as simple as knowing enough to know how big a gamble you are taking. At its core, it can be simple as just knowing the odds. There was an article in the New Scientist recently that focused on risk intelligence, essentially described as the ability to accurately estimate probability or having the right amount of certainty to make educated guesses. It's a simple definition, even if the task itself is very complex. At its essence, assessing risk is about learning how to act on the basis of limited information and how to cope with an uncertain world. It's about knowing your limitations and odds of success and odds of failure. Expert gamblers have a chance to make money because they know the odds. Careless gamblers simply lose their money. There are subtle differences. They both gamble in a manner that appears to be compulsive, but expert gamblers know how much to bet and they evaluate each opportunity. Shipping is no place for careless gamblers. The risks are too high. The playing environment changes every day, while political and social demands shift with the tides. But in closing, I would like to remind everyone here about who takes the most risk in shipping. We all have an obligation to make sure we never gamble with the lives of our seafarers. If we take commercial or regulatory risks that endanger seafarers' lives, we're letting ourselves, our industry, and our society down. As members of the London Marine Cluster, we should all have one simple rule that I tell the staff of Lloyd's Register and I will tell you, and this should govern the risks that we take. If your son or your daughter worked on or near the asset you are assessing or insuring, what would your tolerance be for the associated risk? Would you risk their livelihoods on the spin of a wheel? Thank you very much.